James, you work with the BBC Media Action. Practically speaking, how can we support journalists and the media, around elections? The panelists have already talked about the real pressures that come to bear.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, obviously we're doing a lot of support around elections. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about that, so you're going to see in the presentation I've got some little pictures and captions, so please read those as I go through, which is making some quite busy slides. But just last year, something like 110 million people we engaged with through kind of large-scale public debates, often around elections, big question time type programs, which put senior politicians, sometimes presidential candidates, in front of ordinary people to be challenged and questioned and interrogated about what they were doing in terms of holding them to account and what they were promising in terms of their programs around elections. So there's an awful lot you can do at scale. Just before getting into the presentation, I agree with the issue around training. I think there's an awful lot of training going on in the media support field, which doesn't actually equip people, journalists, to be journalists. To be a journalist, you need not just training, the skills. You need to have an environment, an institutional environment, a legal environment, a regulatory environment that allows you to be a journalist. And if that's not there, doing some short-term training isn't going to do very much for you. And so a lot of what we're doing certainly is to do the capacity building, the support, the training, within the context of actually producing programming, producing drama, but also producing the kind of big public debates and trying to create some kind of protection so that journalists can be journalists and do the kind of trusted, more balanced, impartial coverage that Dawood is referring to. What I've been asked to do is to sort of try and pull some of this together in terms of sort of some of the overarching role of media in elections, which is kind of massively difficult to do. But I think the first thing I just wanted to just sort of take a note of is that the key role around elections is actually media's between elections. And there's this quote from Paul Collier. We asked him to come to a meeting we helped organise in Salzburg a little while ago, and he said this, which I thought summed it up nicely. Elections can work to discipline governments, but they only work if life is breathed into institutions. And the process of breathing life into those institutions is basically having an informed and organised society. A free and active media delivers both of these. The long arguments around whether we ought to be supporting democracy or governance in the context of procedural democracy, having an election and then equating that election to the existence of democracy, to more substantive forms of democracy, that's going to keep running and running. But any version, any vision of a substantive democracy fundamentally depends on a free and open media, but also on the character of that media, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. So what are, when we do proposals, when we talk about all the wonderful things media is expected to deliver, and we've heard about them already, this is the kind of nice positive gloss and narrative we put on it. You can't really have an informed electorate without a proper media. You can't really have a fair election often without election monitoring. And Michaela talked a bit about this, but one of the most extraordinary things around the performance of the Kenya media around most of the elections, but particularly 2007 and 8, and also to some extent in the last one, was the extraordinary investment they put into media, into monitoring of ballot papers. Kind of journalists all over the country actually monitoring the ballot, and you see that again and again. And when you have a strong media, as you do in Kenya, you have this extraordinary scrutiny of electoral process, the scrutiny of both the ballot and the scrutiny of the counting process. Now, actually, in Kenya, a lot of that fell down. In the 2007-8 election, famously, two of the major media houses had exit polls, and they could have been a really important source of checking on the result of what was seen as being, by many, as being a rigged election. Their software inexplicably broke down in both cases. But there is a really important role of media in actually checking the conduct above and beyond of the formal electoral observers. Media play a really key role in this. it's a platform for debate. It's a scrutiny of policy positions, exactly the kind of thing that we're doing. And this picture is of Open Jirga, which Dawood mentioned, which is a partnership between BBC Media Action and RTA, the state broadcaster. The reason we're working with RTA, the state broadcaster, which is still very much under the thumb of the state, is that they've agreed that on this series of on Open Jirga, which is basically putting senior politicians in front of ordinary people, ordinary Afghans drawn from across the country, and in this case, the presidential debates, 9 of the 11 presidential candidates took part. Ashraf Ghani is the person on the left. They've agreed that this can be produced in accordance with BBC editorial guidelines. So it's an entirely balanced debate. But RTA reaches across the whole country, rural, urban, everywhere. And so it is a genuinely national debate reaching at least 6 million people in the country. I think media produce drama and they produce turnout. I remember around the 2007, I think it was, Ugandan elections, Daily Monitor, doing an unusual, an opinion poll, which actually for the first time really put Besigye quite close on the opinion polls to Museveni, galvanized the whole thing simply by doing an opinion poll in the country, one of the first that had been produced at that time. They inject drama, they inject energy, they inject incentives for turnout around elections. It's the outlet for articulation of citizen demands and expectations, and as Michaela was saying, there's also an expectation, particularly on the part of many donors, that they will produce peace. And actually the Kenyan elections, again, were not just a product of the reflections of the performance of the media as a reaction to the 2007-8 election, but actually a lot of donor coverage donor money was going, how can we sort of support media that it's going to help create a peaceful election? And I completely incidentally agree with Michaela, and we've done a research briefing looking at doing a whole series of interviews around a national debate program we have in Kenya, also around the election, called Sema Kenya, Speak Kenya. And there's got a reflection by the presenter about Joseph Warungu, quite well-known BBC television presenter, who said it was actually particularly difficult to get difficult issues discussed in the debates. He kept on trying to push people to raise genuine grievances and to get that, but the climate at the time and the rest of the media coverage, there was an absolute sense that you could not talk about difficult, awkward issues. And I think there is a lot of people who are talking about this peace lobotomy in Kenya. And the concern isn't just about whether that created a more cosmetic election. It wasn't a real election. But is it storing up grievances for the future? If the media is not reflecting the real concerns of people, and clearly, given the last 2007-8 election, those concerns are massive. Grievances have been stored up for years. Part of the 2007-8 election violence was because people felt that their grievances had not been addressed for decades. Then that's a real concern for the future, is that if the media is not reflecting these issues in the public debate, then that's like a cauldron. Is it a pressure cooker? And that's a question, but it's a real concern. And I think the other thing to remember about media is it's, at least in development terms, with the Overseas Development Institute, in terms of the development world, it's cheap. You don't pay for a lot of it. So the media does a lot of it itself. It's largely commercially funded. It's producing, at least in terms of its analysis, a set of public goods around elections and elsewhere, which are largely paid for by other people. And so it's actually if the market's working, and if in its ideal, it's a remarkably cost-effective way of ensuring a genuinely open public debate. That's the nice side. That's all the gloss. That's the positive side. That's the kind of stuff we like to talk about when we're championing the role of the media. But as Michaela and others have talked about, we're really worried about some of the trends we're seeing across the countries in which we're working, most of which are fragile states. So now 24 countries in which we're doing governance work. So we're seeing on the positive side, and that's been a large part of the narrative, obviously, over recent years, a massive liberation of communication space and booming media and social media, engines of democracy, engines of democratic voice, democratic energy, civic participation, massive change. We've seen what's happened in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world. So an extraordinary level of change, and I think that's important to acknowledge that in sort of 2 or 3 or 4 years, it's an absolute extraordinary level of transformation in media and communication environments, not just in terms of access to mobile telephony and growth of internet and new technologies, but also in the traditional media. The traditional media has boomed in many cases, and it's fragmented. The traditional media is a lot more of it, and and it is increasingly catering for particular audiences. What Michaela said about the kind of shift towards the growth of vernacular media in Kenya, we're seeing that in many, many different countries, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We're seeing more and more killing, intimidation, and attacks on journalists. The political incentives for actually nurturing a free and plural media are not that great. The political incentives for seriously intimidating media are pretty strong. And so in terms of the political economy of a media, actually nurturing a genuinely independent, free and plural media in a country is a very, very difficult thing to sustain. You don't get many rewards for it if you're a political leader. You do, unfortunately, get rewards for seriously intimidating media and getting them on side. So we're seeing increasing co-option, factionalization, growth of hate media. Most politicians in many countries are waking up to the fact that if you really want to secure political loyalty, it's always been, media has always been a key factor, but it's becoming more and more of a factor, and it's often not particularly difficult to set up your own broadcaster, to pay for your own broadcaster, to intimidate a broadcaster, to get media, newspapers, broadcasters on side is becoming a growing trend that we're seeing, and it's difficult to see where genuinely independent media that is capable of reflecting different perspectives in society, where is that going to come from? Very few people are paying for that. The advertising markets are not necessarily paying for that, except for in a few countries. Curiously, somewhere like Somalia is one of them. But by and large, we're seeing growing co-option, fractionalization of this. And just to say, a lot of this is rooted in a lot of the research we've done over the last 2 or 3 years. And if you go to our website, we've got policy briefings on these issues in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Somalia, in Kenya, in Afghanistan, in other countries, where we've done really quite detailed analyses of what is actually happening to the media and communication environments in those countries, but not just what's happening, why is it happening? What are the drivers that are shaping the structure and content and behavior of the media? We're seeing a continuing low level of journalistic pay and long-standing issue of brown envelope journalism, where bribes being being taken by journalists to cover particular issues, but it seems it goes ever greater. It's a long-standing issue. It's epidemic proportions, and unfortunately, all the hope a lot of us had in the 80s and 90s that if with the liberalisation of the media, the kind of massive blossoming of independent commercial media, which were really, in my view, a sort of unprecedented historical opening up of public and political space in the 1980s and 1990s. The business models and advertising markets, in our view, it's not obvious that they're there to support it. Dawood was talking about the extraordinary media environment that exists in Afghanistan. Something like 10,000 people are employed in the media in the media industry in Afghanistan. The amount of advertising available in that country to support the extraordinary media that has grown in the country, largely as a result of external foreign investment, but also donor investment, is something like $20 million a year. It's not enough to sustain the media that has grown in that country. So only two things will happen, as Dawood was saying. It will either consolidate and shrink, or it will fall into the hands of those who can afford to pay for it. And that is what we're seeing to a significant degree, and fear seeing far more in the future, is that there's going to be the warlords, those subsidized sometimes by Iran, and this is already happening, will increasingly be determining media content in a country with obvious consequences for fragility and polarisation in the country.
So if you had a couple of points about how can we help, and then we want to open up a little bit to the audience and give a chance to people to ask some questions.
One thing needs to happen, and this is on the last slide. The way in which most support to media happens around elections, and we did a conference on this a couple of years ago, and many electoral management bodies came to that, is that, okay, we need to think about the media, so we'll do some training. The training happens maybe 6 months, we start planning that 6 months before an election, something like that. And so it's all last minute, you're not really clear what you're trying to achieve through that, you're getting people together. We need a much more systematic and strategic approach to what are the challenges facing the media in a country in increasingly fragmented and factionalized media and communication environments, and what really needs to happen to support that media, not just for organizations like us, but for Fatima and many, many other organizations. And that needs to happen across the electoral cycle. And in my view, the best thing you can do is to really do your scoping, your analysis, your research into the role of media around elections 6 months after an election in preparation for the next one, not 6 months before the election when you're scrabbling around trying to work out what the heck to do. And if we start integrating that into the development system, into the ways in which electoral management bodies, electoral commissioners, and others tasked with supporting elections, if that really starts to happen in a much more strategic way, then I think we've got some hope of really starting to get a bit more serious about this issue.
Okay, thank you very much, James.